So, if everybody's looked at their handy-dandy little outline that everybody received, right? I did. Last week we talked about fasting. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah, please.
So last week we spoke a lot about fasting, and we mostly focused on the physical aspects, the bodily aspects of fasting.
Right.
Are there any spiritual aspects that you would like to emphasize?
Well, the spiritual aspects are the whole point, really. The point of all of the bodily fasting is so that you can learn to fast from engaging your thoughts. That's the whole point. That's the real ascetic task. And all of the fasting and the prostration, all this other stuff, is to bring yourself into control, so you can bring your mind under control, so that you're not distracted by a constant stream, your stream of consciousness, this constant stream of thoughts and images and ideas and distractions and stuff from the outside and stuff from the inside and passions, and so that you can stay focused. Because that focus is really the core, it's the most kind of essential aspect of what it takes to pray and to really to lead a spiritual life. Really, so much of what we do is on the surface. You know, we operate in terms of thoughts, in terms of ideas, in terms of pious feelings, in terms of external actions, and all of this other stuff. But if our mind is a million miles away and we're standing in church and we're thinking about, you know, when's the service going to be over, the choir is off key, and what's for breakfast, we're not exactly praying. You know, if we're standing doing our prayers in the morning or in the evening, and we're thinking about, you know, why did he say that, or why did she say that, and what is so and so, and on and on and on. We're not praying. You know, we may even be saying the words, and I think we all have that experience, you know, of reading the words but not being present to them. But the point is not just to be present to the words, the point is to be present to God. And the only way to be present to God is through the faculty of attention. And to fix our attention on God doesn't mean to fix our attention on the idea of God. And this is really important. It's not the idea of God, it's the presence of God that we fix ourselves on. And so when we begin to pray, when we begin to fast, when we begin anything, the first thing we should do is open our attention, open our awareness, and pay attention to the presence of God. Now, in our culture, our attention spans have gotten shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter. Until now, I think the average attention span is like 8 minutes, 7 minutes, whatever. As long as a TV show is between commercials, that's a typical American attention span, and that's pretty pathetic when it comes down to it. It used to be that people were able to pay attention for long periods of time. That's why the services are so long. That's why sermons used to be so long. You read the homilies of St. John Chrysostom. You know, they're pages and pages and pages long, which meant he went on for a long time. And how many of us have the patience or the attention span to listen to a preacher who goes on for 20 minutes or half an hour? Not too many. Not too many. So this training of the attention is not only to stay fixed, but to be able to ignore all of the external thoughts, even the ones that attract us, is the real core of what asceticism is about. Now, one of the biggest issues in the whole spiritual life, this goes with fasting, and it goes with prayer, and it goes is what we do with our thoughts, because the highest level of consciousness that we can attain is to the pure consciousness of God. Actually, St. Isaac says it's to be conscious in God, which is a pretty mind-blowing concept when you start thinking about it. Because the two levels of consciousness that we have are kind of in competition. When we're trying to be spiritually aware and spiritually conscious, if we've got if we're paying attention to the whole stream of consciousness, all the thoughts, the ideas, the images, everything that's just going across the screen of our mind, we don't have a chance to really focus. There's another aspect of this that's really critically important. We think that we are our thoughts to a great extent. You've got this whole nonsense from Descartes, I think, therefore I am. And so far as the Orthodox spiritual vision, that's nonsense. It's nonsense. But it's penetrated our culture to the extent that some people are terrified of inner stillness. They think that they will simply disappear if they completely silence their mind. That's not true at all. Because there's a deeper level of consciousness that you can only access when you've got that superficial level of the thoughts silenced and ignored. Now, we can't really silence it because it's there, and it's. But what we do is that we, instead of keeping our attention on this level of this superficial level of consciousness, the rational level of consciousness, we need to redirect our attention inwards, where our attention is not on external things, but it's on the presence of God. And the deeper we go, the more completely we can do that, the better. What happens when you fast? When you really fast? I'm not just talking about, having a fish sandwich at McDonald's instead of a Big Mac. I'm talking about not eating until 3 o'clock in the afternoon for several days in a row, and then having only vegetables. No oil, and real strict fasting according to the rule. Is that your mind becomes so clear that you don't have trouble going internally. That's what happens. That's why the fathers emphasized fasting, because it brings you to a state of clarity of mind and awareness. Now, this whole process is connected with the process of working out repentance, or metania, which means transformation of mind. That's really what repentance, papiania, means. And what happens is that not only do you have to learn how to ignore the thoughts, it's that you renounce them. And it's an ascent by renunciation, so that you can overcome the influence of those thoughts. Now, this is pretty high level stuff, okay? But this is like the philokalia in.
Does renounce mean?
Say I don't want it. It's no longer. I no longer accept it.
Isn't it better just to ignore them than to renounce them?
It depends on what it is. First, you have to start out with ignoring. Then eventually you start out with renouncing.
If you renounce something, doesn't that imply that you first kind of started arguing with it, elaborating on it?
No, not at all. It means that because there are different meanings to renunciation in that sense. The ascetic life, the spiritual life, is precisely an ascent through renunciation. It's through leaving things behind. The fathers talk about levels of renunciation. First level is you renounce your external attachments, friends, family, your stuff. You just let it go. Doesn't mean you stop relating to them. It's that you don't. Is that you reorder your relationship with them. The next level of renunciation is your thoughts, and the attachments to the conceptual images. Does that make sense? Think about a conceptual image, a picture in words, a conceptual image of all of these things, people, places, position, and you let it go. And then the final level of renunciation, which only comes after years and years, is of concepts altogether, including the concept of God. So that you don't, and it's not that you let go of God. It means you let go of your idol of God that you have created of God. So instead of relating to your idea of God, you're standing naked in the infinite abyss. So that's with nothing to hold on to.
What's the difference between that kind of renunciation and Buddhist nirvana?
Well, I don't know what the content of Buddhist nirvana is, but the content of the infinite abyss of God in Christians is the person of the Father being united in the Son by the Holy Spirit. So it's, in other words, it's direct. In other words, you're completely opening yourself to the personal presence of God in Christ by the Spirit.
The concept of Trinity is a concept, so you are not renouncing that concept.
But you're not thinking about the concept. You're experiencing God.
And it's kind of hard to understand.
Yeah, it is, because it's beyond concept.
So it's beyond intellectual capacity.
It's way beyond intellectual.
It's only,
yeah.
It's for the nous.
Right, it's ineffable, inconceivable, invisible, incomprehensible.
Can people walk around in that state, or is this something that it can only happen at certain periods in private time?
It happens in prayer, and usually the people to whom it happens very often go off and become hermits. The hermits aren't out there, with 18 volumes of liturgical books going through hours and hours of services a day, for the most part. They're using the Jesus prayer, but they're not even using the Jesus prayer. They're beyond the Jesus prayer into pure silence, where the Jesus prayer takes you, when you go deep enough. And so, and so what's happened? What happens when you're fasting? For a short time, you're renouncing certain kinds of foods, right? Mm-hmm. You're renouncing animal products, dairy and stuff. But it's for a certain specified time. When you're fasting from images, say you renounce TV, at least for a certain amount of time. You renounce the movies. You renounce playing on YouTube and the computer. In other words, you may renounce it permanently, or you can renounce it for a certain part of time. But you're setting it apart from yourself and not engaging in that. Now, those of course are all external. But spiritual fasting is not just renouncing the food and renouncing, things like that. It's renouncing thoughts. So, really the core of spiritual discipline is what we do with our thoughts. What kind of thoughts are we allowing into our minds? Are we allowing jealous and angry and envious thoughts and judgmental thoughts or lustful thoughts or depressed thoughts and despondency and all of that kind of thing? Are we allowing gluttonous thoughts? You sitting there during the liturgy and during the pre-sanctified liturgy, and all you're thinking about is a McDonald's hamburger or something like that. I like that's a good example. I don't even like McDonald's hamburgers that much, but it's a great image, Or a pizza that's covered with sausage or something, who knows, or a fine steak, whatever. All the thoughts work the same. The lustful thoughts, the gluttonous thoughts, the despondency, the envy, the jealousy, even the pride and vainglory, it all works the same. And these are all on the superficial layer of consciousness, which is not really who we are. And this is really critically important. That's not who we are. That's what we call the ego. Or that's the false self. It's the old man in scriptural language. It's the person that we have created, or it's the image of the person, of the individual actually, that we are projecting, that we want other people to think about us as. In other words, there's all that controversy going on about this woman who was passing as black, recently. And so, who was it? Rush Limbaugh, he said, "From now on, I'm skinny." Okay. Yeah. Well, no, I mean, it's saying, if this obviously, very Germanic-looking white woman can say, well, I'm black, and Rush Limbaugh, or I, could say, I'm skinny, and it's just as absurd. But you can create a whole identity around it. And this is what we do, is we create a whole identity. We create a whole idea of who we are that we project to other people, and we think that it's real. And in fact, it's not. It's a creation of our own passions, of our own pride and vainglory. It's a creation of our own fear. That people will really see us as we are. Therefore, I'm gonna project that I'm something different than I am. And all of this is on the level of the ego. But our thoughts are usually all about that. Now, one very current topic, for example, and I can get into real trouble on this because this is totally politically incorrect, is that if people have homosexual thoughts, they think that because they have homosexual thoughts, that they're gay. That instead of, oh, I have these thoughts, they say, no, I am this. Well, no. The reality is, you're not that. You're a person, a human being who has all sorts of thoughts like everybody else, and they happen to go in that particular direction. But that's not who you are. It's not who you are. Because who we are is not found on the level of the rational consciousness. It's not deep enough. It's not who it's who we think we are. The true identity is the deep person of the heart, which can only be actualized and realized through stillness. Through this path of renunciation. And so what do we renounce first? Our thoughts and attachments to all these concepts, ultimately the concepts of ourself, because it's all false. You know, I could say, oh, well, I can speak Russian, I can think in Russian, I must be a Russian. No. You know, it's not who I am, you know. And all of that kind of stuff. Languages and races and nationalities and all that is all a construct. It's all a human construct. And it's not who we are. It's what, you know, maybe where we're from, but it's all on this superficial level. And who we are is on a far deeper level, because it's hidden with Christ in God, to quote St. Paul. And it's that level of identity which is what we're trying to get to when we live an authentic spiritual life. See, authentic spirituality is not just about doing all the disciplines and things like that. We need to do that. That's a beginning of training. But there's a huge difference between a kid who's going through basic training in the military and a mature officer. Just like there's a huge difference between an Orthodox Christian who's just beginning to use the spiritual disciplines and somebody who's deeply mature. And so our task is to become mature as Christians, to mature in our spiritual life, and which means essentially to come into greater and greater awareness and surrender to God. So that one of the things that's essential for us to renounce is our own will, so that we may hear the word of God and do it. And because if you think about what does our will usually consist of, it means gratifying our passions. Oh, I want to have this for dinner. Oh, I really like that, you know, piece of jewelry. Oh, I like these clothes. Oh, I want, you know, I'd like to be, you know, built like Brad Pitt or whatever, you know. It's, you know, we have all these thoughts and desires. Oh, I really like that guy. I'd really like him to be my husband, except he's married and so am I, but to other people, and well, that's not going to stop me. You know, and so what happens? Marriages are wrecked. You know, people's lives are destroyed because of passions. And so one of the most, you know, this is not on one hand, you know, all of this occurs on the superficial level of the mind, but most people live on that very superficial level. We live caught up totally in our thoughts, without a concept of renouncing the thoughts, renouncing the desires, renouncing our own will, and submitting completely to the will of God. And because we kind of want our cake and eat it too. We want to be thought of. Remember this whole thing about ego projection. We want to be thought of as good, pious Christians, and all, and so we go through all the motions, and and everybody's all the women are all wrapped up, and it's constant orthoaerobics in church, and the sign of the cross and bows and prostrations, and so everybody says, "Oh, look at that person! They must be holy." No. Not necessarily. They may just be going through the motions in order to portray. Now, and that's the difference between real piety and false piety. Because what I just described is false piety. Not that women shouldn't cover their heads, not that people shouldn't make the sign of the cross and do prostrations. But why are you doing it? You see, and so part of this and part of the task is to be aware of our motives for doing what we're doing. Say women covering their heads in church. Okay, the church prescribes it. The scriptures prescribe it. St. John Chrysostom said, "This is the one liturgical vestment that is prescribed in the entire New Testament, and it's not culturally relative. It's a universal command that applies to all Christians, everywhere, at all times." That's St. John Chrysostom, okay? So, why do you cover your head in church? Why do you not cover your head in church? Is it an act of defiance against the, is it simply forgetting your scarf at home? or is it, are you trying to project a certain image to other people? Or are you doing it solely as a means of obedience to God without any of these other thoughts getting in the way? You see, and it comes, and when we're engaged in the spiritual life, it really is cutting down and really looking at our motives and looking at not only why we're doing things, but how we're doing things. And are we trying to attract attention to ourselves? Is it an ego-gratifying thing? Are we doing it to please somebody else? Or are we simply doing it as an expression of love? Love for God, love for the church, obedience. Women covering their heads in church is a good example of that. Because it's a little controversial. In Roquefort, not so much. In others, it's way controversial. But or is it simply an expression of, well, I'm Russian and therefore I'm going to cover my head in church? Because that's what Russians do. Well, and so what do you get? Women coming in halter tops and mini skirts with a head covering, which is absurd, right? It's absurd. Because the whole point is what? Modesty. And of course, to get all the details of where it came from, you have to read the book of Enoch, which is not in the scriptures. Because St. Paul makes this allusion to it, says, because of the angels. And what was it? There's stories in the book of Enoch that he's alluding to, that the angels looked down on human women and became lustful because they were so beautiful and had long, beautiful hair. And so women are supposed... And so the tradition came about that women cover their heads in church because of the angels.
Aren't angels everywhere?
Yeah.
So then why just in church?
Though that's the other point. And
Angels can't see through our headscarf?
well, no, that and that's the thing about the story. I mean, that's, you can't overanalyze the story. But that's what it comes from. I'm just citing.
Okay.
It's way too easy to overanalyze some of this stuff. But do you see my point? Do you follow? Yeah. So we have the spiritual sense of fasting, which means to be able to renounce our passions and desires, say for a nice steak, and put it aside for X amount of time, and that by training ourselves to do this, it'll help us to renounce and lay aside other kinds of thoughts, lustful and angry and envious and resentful and other kinds of thoughts, which are simply distractions. And this is something that's really, really, really helpful and incredibly important. Our thoughts are basically just distractions. We put so much value on them. We think we're these, we're coming up with all these brilliant ideas, and some of them may be, some of them may not be. But if we're standing in church and we're thinking about, how to better design a camera so that you can find the stupid power inlet, you're distracted. Right? You're distracted. There's a line in the prayers of St. Isaac the Syrian, which I really love. It's something like, "Preserve me from the troublesome distraction of lust." And when you think about it, if that's all it is, and think about how worked up we get about it, right? Maybe men more than women, but I doubt it, quite frankly. It's just a troublesome distraction. So, what do we do with the troublesome distraction? We let it go. We don't pay attention to it. It's like a mosquito buzzing around. You can swat it and sort of swat it away. Animal rights activist. I was at a meeting once in Point Reyes, in Bolinas, which is the most politically correct place on the face of the earth. It's where all the old hippies went to die. It's really quite funny. And Bolinas has a lot of horses, because these are trust funder hippies whose lives and habits couldn't be supported otherwise. There were flies buzzing around in this meeting, and somebody went to swat a fly, and one of the local Methodist pastor or something says, "Wait, what about the rights of the fly?" Okay. So, we just can't tell anybody about that on Capitol Hill. Otherwise, it'll be a whole new movement. But you see the whole point of spiritual fasting, right? And how critically important it is not to believe our thoughts, that they're really about who we are. And this is one of the reasons why the fathers, when they write about prayer, and they talk about prayer on the deeper levels, talk about the descent of the mind into the heart. Because the heart, or the nous, the core of our person, is where our true identity is found. And in the heart is, or the nous, does not deal with concepts. It doesn't deal with any of the data from the senses. It doesn't process. That's not what it does. The rational mind, in a sense, the brain is the rational mind, and the heart is the deep self, the spiritual deep self. And the brain is what processes all the data from our senses, right? You know, what we see, what we hear, what we smell, what we taste, and then what we desire, and and anger, and all the passions, and all this other stuff, as well as everything we read, everything that we see, everything that it all gets processed in our rational mind. But the heart, the spiritual center of our being, the nous, perceives God and perceives other spiritual beings, including other people, directly. Not through the senses and not through concepts. One of the biggest things that happens when in relationships is that we construct an image, a conceptual image of a person, and we relate to that conceptual image. It's not the person, it's our conceptual image, our expectations of who they are and how they're going to act and what they're going to say and what their ideas are and all of that. And sometimes it's right and sometimes it's way off. Of course, we do the same thing with God. We construct this image, the typical American image of this old man sitting on a cloud, who's way out there, who's not particularly involved, but who's really ticked off at us and just waiting to damn us to hell. Yeah.
So you're saying when you're fasting, you can see clearly more. When you're saying you're clear, does that mean you don't have as much of the buzzing bees around you?
Right. Right.
But can you also see things better, or does that come after more discipline?
That's way, way more discipline.
So the only thing that really goes away is that that thoughts aren't as annoying. When
you're more focused.
On
you can focus your attention better.
Okay.
Now, unless your attention is so distracted by being hungry, which can be a distraction. But to a great extent, when you're fasting, you can really focus. You can focus better. And that's the physical side. We're integral, whole integral beings. So what we do physically has an impact on what happens spiritually as well as mentally. And what we do mentally has an impact on our spiritual and physical. For example, I don't know, if you get depressed, for example, that not only are you kind of, is your mind real, what happens, you're just focused totally inwards, mentally, but spiritually as well. And physically, what happens? You sleep a lot, you don't relate, you want to relate to anybody else, there's physical aspects to it. Or when you get angry, and if we get really, really angry, not just passing irritation, but really, really angry, of course, we have our heart rate increases, we tend to turn red, we want to hit somebody or something, and we get all wrapped up in the passion, and mentally that's all we can think about, and spiritually we're just out to lunch. And so, so we're whole beings. Part of what authentic Christian spirituality is about is becoming whole, and becoming real, and becoming authentically the person that we were made to be, which is not manipulated by our passions, but is rather that we are in control of ourselves and can keep our attention focused on God and on other people. Now, the thought came to me that I'd kind of like to develop a little bit. What is love in this context? In our culture, we've got love and lust totally confused. Love and lust may or may not have anything to do with each other. They probably don't, because lust is about self-gratification, and love is completely about the other person. And on the deeper levels, love is not simply liking the person, tolerating the person, being nice to them, and wanting to be near them. Love is to be able to noetically perceive the other person. Mutually. So and that's what it means to be of one mind and one heart. And it's beyond words, it's beyond images, it's beyond concepts. And it means that you have to, and this is what happens like in a mature marriage, you lay aside all your expectations, because you don't have to have any expectation. You lay aside your conceptual image of the person, because you know the person for who they are. And this is the difference between relating as simply as an individual, as individuals, or as true persons. Because the deepest level of relationship is this purely spiritual relationship, which transcends any kind of lust, any kind of desire, any kind of conceptual idolatry. They say one of the reasons that for young couples just getting married is so difficult is because she has all her daddy issues, he has all his mommy issues, and they get projected on the spouse. And so they may be having sex, but they're not relating. It's like this, there's no communication. Or maybe like that. Until they get over that and can simply see and accept the other person purely for who they are without any projections. And this takes years to develop. It takes years. So, and so on. I hate to use the religious level, but on the level of our relationship with God, what are we trying to do? We're trying to get beyond our concepts of God so that we can really relate to God as He is. And not just our concept of God, which is an idol that we create in our own image with our own mind. But in order to be able to do that, we have to be able to set aside all of these thoughts about God and our expectations and all this other stuff. Just have to set it aside and simply let God be God and give thanks to Him. And that's what we're called to do. And that's the beginning of authentic spirituality.
That occurs mostly when you're more adult than a child.
Oh, yeah.
So how do you start training a child to think in terms of goodness and spirituality? Is there any way?
Yeah. You teach them how to fast, you teach them how to pray, you teach them to go to church. to be honest and to develop their own spiritual life within that. It's not just doing it because mom said I had to, but truly for them to want to come to know Christ. And then it develops from there. And that's the way we all start. You know, at one point or another in our lives. Maybe as a child, maybe not. So are there any questions at this point?
That's where I struggle with icons, really. It's still, I mean, when I look at them, I have to like kind of almost get the image of the icon out of my head sometimes. I want to go beyond that. So that's a struggle for me.
I think it was St. John Chrysostom who said that when you pray, you stand before your icons, you light your candle, and you close your eyes.
That's helpful.
Yeah. The icon is there not... you can contemplate it as art, you can contemplate it as religious art or sacred art, but the icon is a manifestation of the presence of Christ. His presence is there. He's there in his personhood. And but you don't want to get stuck on the image.
Yeah.
You go through the image. You know, just like in the liturgy is an image of the heavenly liturgy. It's kind of an image. It's an icon in ritual. Now you can get all stuck in all the details of the ritual. Who goes where, when? Don't spill the candle. Oh, don't light that other altar boy on fire. And all that kind of stuff, and get totally wrapped up in the ritual, and forget the whole point of the ritual is that you go through the ritual to the reality, to the heavenly reality, and this is what's called the anagogical level of the mysteries or the symbols. Sacred symbols. It leads us up. So the icon, none of the icons, the ritual, none of it is an end in itself. It always leads to God. It always refers, and if we can let it, if we can focus enough to be present to what's going on, and not just the cute little altar boy about to light the other one on fire, but the kind of spiritual movement. That's really the core of the liturgy. Prayer as well. Prayer is not about the words. Prayer is about being present to God so that God can, and allowing God to come into your being and work in your heart. And so when we pray, if all we're doing is just standing there and reading words, what are we doing? We're standing there and reading words. But if we remember that we're praying to God, that God is present with us and in us, and that we are in Him, and that what we need to do is simply open ourselves to Him as He opens Himself to us, then the words will not only take on a new meaning, but we can go beyond the words into the pregnant silence of the deeper levels of prayer. Does it make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. St. John, at the end of one of his epistles, has this fantastic quote: "Little children, keep yourselves from idols." That's a profound statement, incredibly profound statement. Little children, keep yourselves from idols. We create idols constantly. We make idols of all sorts of things, but mainly of our own thoughts. And we erect them in place of God. And so it's very important to get beyond that kind of idolatry, and to be present to Him who is, and who is beyond our comprehension, and beyond all conceptual images. Okay. So that was kind of a long answer to a short question, but I think it kind of wraps up the whole concept of fasting, I hope. Yeah. So it's a profoundly spiritual thing. The next thing on the agenda for the class on the syllabus is almsgiving. And we'll just go till 9 o'clock, and so we've got 15 minutes. Almsgiving is really important. There's prayer, there's fasting, there's almsgiving. Now, that are talked about in the New Testament. How many of you have been through the Orthodox crowning service? Wedding. Have you listened to the text? Why?
It's been a while, I don't know.
Well, one of the most important lines in the text is, grant them all the blessings of this earth, that they may in turn be able to be generous to those who are in need. It's really, really, almsgiving is really important. And it's a spiritual thing. It's not just about sharing, which is good and important, out of human love and, satisfying human needs and things like that. It's a spiritual thing to be detached enough from your stuff and from your money and from your resources in order to give to those who are in need. And there are multiple levels of this. One of the things that's really important, I think, is that it has to. There's a personal aspect to it. That we give to those who are in need, who ask of us, and we do it personally. We've all, and you can't live in the city and not encounter people panhandling on the street. And some people, sometimes people are really afraid of them, and sometimes they should be, but but to simply ignore them, what does that say about our Christianity? Actually, one of the things that they may be asking for money, but one of the things that benefits them the most is just to smile and say hello. And in other words, to acknowledge them as a person, not just as an irritation, not just as something to be afraid of, but there's a real person there. And if you can give them something, usually better to go buy them a sandwich than maybe give them money, sometimes. But if you're able to do that, that's a good thing to do. Almsgiving, in particular, means giving to those who are in need. Now, it's very nice that we've got all of this, all these organized charities, and we can write checks, and it's very impersonal, and we never have to come in contact with all of these people who are so scary. But that's not adequate, because that the spiritual value. And we may be able to be generous and all of that, you know, and probably a lot more generous with writing a check than, than giving somebody $5 or $10 on the street or $1. But that personal aspect of extending recognition to another person, and especially somebody who's suffering. They wouldn't be on the street begging if they were not suffering. Right?
For whatever reason.
For whatever reason. Maybe it's self-inflicted. And who knows, we don't have to. Now, St. John of Kronstadt tells us that if you give somebody money and you know they're going to go out and buy booze with it, then that's not, you've defeated your purpose. But if you can extend yourself and actually reach out to the person, it's a beautiful thing. One of the things that we don't find in our society, and it's become outrageous, you know, legally, is that there are some places, many places in the world, especially in traditional societies, where you can simply go into a village and people will, as a stranger, and people will invite you to stay in their home. They've never seen you before, they've never heard of you before, they've never seen any, you know, a person who looks like you before, and yet they'll invite you into their home. In Russia, what I found when I was living there in the early 90s, you'd go to somebody's house and they're ecstatic to extend their hospitality, and you just realize that they put their last scraps of food on the table for you to eat. And that was all they had for the rest of the month. So great was their hospitality. So that's so almsgiving is an essential thing for Christians. Why we don't hear more about it from the pulpit or from the ambo, I'm not sure. But it's essential for us as Christians to extend our hospitality, to extend charity, and to manifest the love of Christ through that. Now, there's another aspect, because part of this whole thing of almsgiving is what do we do with our resources? Now, you can get the idea, oh, this is a spiritual church and we don't talk about money. Well, there's a big problem with that. 2/3 of what Jesus talked about was, what do you do with your resources? Well over half of what Jesus taught had to do with what do you do with your money.